welcome to our podcast, whatever it's going to be called. This is where I don't jinx anything by saying anything. I'm Will Chernoff, and joining me is Carson Tworo. How are you doing, my man?
Doing very well. Very excited to speak with you and start this show.
Yeah, why the heck did we start doing this? That's a very good question, but one that we both probably have our own answers for. I mean, I almost want to throw to you first and just see how you would sum that up if I put you on the spot and was like, well, how do we start having these conversations that we have all the time? Why are we doing them here now? What got you over the edge?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, like we've for years now, I feel like gone back and forth sending each other articles and thoughts and lots of discussions about like this intersection of music and tech, I think is maybe where it started. But also when you talk about tech and the tech platforms that surround music now, becomes discussions about the music business as well more broadly. And I think we've just been doing that for long enough that we began, getting into some really interesting discussions, and to the point where it's like, yeah, we should get these down and start to form a cohesive set of ideas about this stuff together.
Yeah, because we're tech people, but we're not tech bros. We're interested in like a little bit of investing and business related topics, but we're not finance bros.
Yeah.
You know, we've both had a 10 plus year musical history together, but we're not full-time professional musicians. So we're in the middle of the triangle and we're looking around at the different sides of it all the time, and we're like, what's going on? And it's gonna be really fun to have some more chats about all this stuff that we're out here consuming.
Yeah. Should we say like generally what we want to focus on? I mean, that's kind of it. Music business, tech platforms that affect all those things. Is there anything like, I mean, I guess we'll get into it as we go episode by episode. It'll be a lot of different things, but anything else to add about the topic?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of where I'm coming from, if you have no idea what I'm up to personally and you stumbled upon this, I mean, I have a services business where I do services for music companies, and then I have a website called Rhythm Changes that I run around that too, where I cover the Vancouver jazz scene, which is where I've been hanging out for like 10 plus years, and Carson and I met in that community. So I have all these views and reactions to things just from doing my work, but also just from like the layperson's interest. Like I've never held down a tech job or anything, but I've always like kept my eye on those subjects. And I'm an enthusiast, but a layperson. But in terms of the music world, I mean, and the business world, I guess, just from the very small scale of messing around and learning as you go, doing your own thing. Like I have my opinions that I've come to from doing that. But then on the side of tech, you know, I just have my layperson and user experience from being a nerdy kid and from writing that all the way through. So it's kind of similar to where you're coming from, you know, but it's also a little bit different, but we arrive at the same place together.
Yeah. And even as we're saying this now, I think maybe one thing, and maybe why now, is we've had now, I would say about a decade, maybe like 12 to 14 years of like the platform economy, maybe this era that we're in right now, this streaming, and that is maybe coming to a bit of an inflection point or a turning point.
Yep.
And so we have like, we grew up in that, like that's been the water we've been swimming in as musicians and consumers of music and media. And so I think now we're in this place where there's lots of criticism, like music criticism, writing, lots of people thinking about this, lots of stuff to like digest, think about, and react to. And so that's, I think, some of what we're going to be diving into.
Yeah, but not related to any of that. We last saw each other in person at the time of recording. It was only 2 nights ago when you came out to my show, which I really appreciated, at the Hot Deli in Vancouver, which is also known as the Lido. So thanks for coming down. You heard my band, 4-piece band, playing some jazz music, hung out with some of our friends. You have a good time?
I had a great time, and I was introduced to that record of Ron Miles, Greg Saunier, and Mary Halverson. I'd never heard it before, and it's so good. I mean, Greg Saunier is like, his drumming in Deerhoof is some of my favorite drumming ever. I didn't know that he played those jazz trio records.
Yeah, I think that's a one-off. I don't know if they have another one, but yeah, there's some fun stuff to explore there. That's cool that you dug that one in particular.
That's cool.
Yeah. Speaking of digging, here's your transition. You don't host 100 podcast episodes for nothing, right?
Nice.
Brandon Shaw's Digging the Greats iPod series is the reason we're getting together today to talk. This is the big piece of red meat that we have digested and that we wanted to talk about. I've watched it 2 times now. It's a 4-part YouTube series that a quite successful YouTuber under the channel name Digging the Greats conducted in June of 2024, and he published it right after that in July of last year. I don't know if you would have come across this at all because he's talked about Patreon and stuff, but on the way into this, after watching it for the second time, I looked at his Graphtreon, you know, the site where you can see Patreon stats and kind of inferred earnings and things like that. And he's actually doing even better or just as well now as he was back when he published it. At the time we're speaking right now, he's near like his all-time high of 1,000-ish paid patrons.
Wow.
But he established that high back in August 2024 after publishing this series. So this was a hit piece of content for him. He has a rank of 60 among music creators on Patreon. So this is one of the top 100 biggest music-related creators who uses Patreon in terms of how much he makes. So he's doing great. He put a lot of TLC into this, but from his own admission in the series, it turned into something more significant for him, not only content-wise, but personally than he expected. And you actually sent this to me first in terms of getting it on my radar not long after it came out. And we're going to talk about all 4 parts of the series, what we thought about the different things he included, interviews, experiences he had out in the world, projects he dug into on his own, kind of culminating in a triumphant jailbreak of a custom iPod. But we're going to talk about all that and what we got out of it. But since you introduced it to me, do you have anything that you wanted to tee off with about how you remember discovering it? Because I don't remember that right now.
Yeah, I mean, I had checked out some of the Digging the Greats videos prior to this one. He talks a lot about like a lot of the music that I'm interested in. He's really focused on, really knowledgeable about like the Soulquarians era of like neo soul. He's got a lot of good videos about music production and Jay Dilla, music that's been really influential to me. And so I've always found him to have like very smart takes about music. And without being like, he's, as far as I can tell, not a huge like music theory head, and he does play instruments, but I'm not sure that he's got like a super long formal music education. But even absent that, he's like got this insane depth of knowledge, and I've always appreciated his perspective. And so when I saw the title of the first video about using an iPod for a month, I was like, oh, that's really interesting. It's stuff I think about all the time, and it's something I'd been thinking about before this video came up, how Spotify had been impacting my listening. And so that's when I watched it and fired it over to you.
Title of the first one is Using This iPod for 30 Days Changed My Life. Yeah, that all checks out. And I remember consuming it in the fall. So, you know, there's a lot of comments, especially on the first one, of the irony of how it took an algorithmic recommendation to serve up this video or series to many of its thousands of viewers, which is kind of funny. But yeah, I recall when you sent that to me, it was already a topic that was important to you. Yeah, it makes sense that you would have followed his channel before then, because for those who don't know Carson and are listening right now, he's a drummer and producer of electronic-based music, as well as playing jazz drums with me and other people. So those references that he dropped would hit hard for sure. I haven't watched any of his other videos, but I would like to check that out too. Just like I would like to look at all the full-length interviews that he cut from and threw into this. I did not watch those either, and we'll talk about the people that he featured as well. But that's the first week of his 4-week 4-part series, Using This iPod for 30 Days Changed My Life. And he actually narrates the first 2 videos in the series from week 3.
Yeah.
that seems to be where he realized, oh, this is going to be a whole thing.
Yeah.
And right from the first video, there's cuts of him from, at the time, the future, saying like, oh, I had no idea how big of a deal or an exploration this was going to be when I started getting into it. But maybe one other thing that we can get set on first is like why it was on your mind before and why we had already been talking about it. You know, we were both thinking about our own music consumption because there's a lot of other creators we were already following who talk about that stuff on a regular basis.
Hmm.
But I also am in a big bubble in terms of this, and I know it. Like, I know I don't have music
Yeah.
consumption habits that resemble a lot of what goes on out there. But at the same time, I'm also not all the way in this like digital pack rat thing the way that
Right.
we've now seen it phrased, you know. So can you describe where you were at the beginning? What was on your mind? What was your habits like? If you take an overview, what were you thinking on the way in?
Yeah, I mean, this even goes back 2 more additional years. I think in spring of 2022, I was looking at my music listening habits, and throughout. So, like you said, we met in music school, and I throughout music school and a couple years after that, I had a really active music listening habit, and I noticed in 2022 that I had basically entirely stopped listening to music at all. And that was concerning to me because it's like a big part of my life. It's something that gave me a lot of joy and something I, used to really enjoy, especially like on Fridays with new records coming out, finding stuff that I really dug. And yeah. And so I'd been thinking about the why. I like noticed the problem. I think it's a problem, still think it's a problem. And, one of the conclusions I came to is that I thought that my use of Spotify or streaming services generally had contributed to that. And so I had this, this ties into his starting point as well, right? Where he noticed he was kind of experiencing this feeling of like not knowing what he wanted to listen to. And that really resonated with me because I definitely had some of that feeling. I had no conclusions at the time. Like when I thought about this in 2022, I actually started writing about it because I was like, well, I should just like write down my thoughts about this.
Yeah.
I found it really demotivating because I had no conclusion. I came to the end of writing out all my complaints about like, I don't listen to music anymore. These algorithmic feeds are making me kind of forget what I really like you're kind of pushing me maybe to there's a bit of a regression to the mean effect where I'm just kind of getting the average of what I usually listen to, but I'd lost some of that spark. I had no conclusion, but I think Brandon comes to some interesting conclusions in this series. So I was happy to hear where he was at. And there's other authors and creators he talks to that I definitely in the interim had checked out.
And as you say there, the in week one featured guest is Kyle Chaika, who wrote the book Filter World that had already been on your mind and on your desk going into it. And maybe we'll talk more about that book on its own in the future because I don't think either of us prepped that book for this episode, did we?
I've read it, but I'm not
Yeah.
fresh on it. But yeah, we can touch on it if we want to summarize what's up. So yeah, I mean, to summarize like where he started, I think this show started with the idea that this series started with the idea that he's just going to stop using Spotify, not stop streaming music, and use a refurbished. There's another word for that.
Certified pre-owned if it was a car, but it's not.
Yeah, well, no, but like it had also been like it had the drive replaced and everything. There's an iPod modding community, so he had bought sort of a modded iPod Classic.
So it was
device.
already modded before. This is a good technical distinction for me, who's not as into it. I mean, you've worked in an Apple retail environment and an IT environment before, like on devices, but like I know he jailbreaks it obviously and customizes it at the end, and we'll get to that. But when he already got it, it was already modified.
I believe so. I believe almost all of those eBay resellers, not modified, but maybe fixed up. Like some of them didn't have adequate, like the storage could like break and freak out. And, that device came out, I think he said 20 years ago at the time of recording. And so there are, technicians who will, put in more reliable storage. They keep the same firmware on it, so it's not like a jailbroken device. He's still relying on, for the most of the series, he's relying on iTunes or the Apple Music app to sync stuff. But I believe if he's bought it off of eBay, I'm sure it's not just like a totally vanilla device.
Yeah, that makes sense because it wouldn't last in that state over that whole period of time unless it was like brand new in the box. And that would be like if you were buying it as a collectible or something. That would be very different.
Yeah. Yeah. And it could certainly be the case that it's all original parts and it just was like happened to be maintained and fixed up before it was sent out. But oftentimes they take them apart before they ship them out to buyers.
But the problem that you identified or that you framed as a problem, for yourself, where you had this problem you wanted to solve about what you were listening to, I think that's the very first line that he says in the first episode where he's like, I haven't been listening to music the same way anymore or something. So there's a kind of zeitgeist around this that built, and that's probably why this series was so successful, is he dropped it right in the middle of this kind of zeitgeist around it. Now it's still rolling and there's more books being published on the subject and things like that. But that's how he begins. And then before even the end of episode 1, he is already like going out there and buying albums on the iTunes store because he has to. And he's like revealing like the real world inconveniences, like he has to rent a van and do a DJ gig or something. Is like a super long drive and he can't listen to music on the drive, right?
Yeah. I'm curious, just before we even like get super into the content, like how do you think, I know you say like you're outside of the streaming bubble, and you've talked about this before in person, where you haven't experienced the same difficulties maybe, but how do you think that like your music consumption has changed in like a platform economy, right? You do use some streaming services and you do buy music and you're somewhere maybe in the middle. How do you think your listening is like different than it would be if we were still in, I don't know, LimeWire, iTunes era?
Yeah. I also get a lot of music delivered to me for free, which is nice.
Right. Yeah.
And unavoidable
That's a perk.
at this point. It shows up whether I want it or not. And you talk about that in broad strokes and never in terms of individual albums. It's all good. But on a very big overview, I mean, when Spotify launched in Canada, I was actually in Europe. I was in Denmark and hanging out. I was 20 years old, and that's a whole other story. But I started using it heavily back then, and that was kind of still in the music blog era, so to speak. So I was kind of still getting my music recommendations from music blogs. I was kind of out of jazz at this point too.
Yeah.
Like I had trained in jazz as a musician, but I kind of moved on to folk and other stuff that I like to listen to. And I was just like going out there and like discovering lots of old music too, thanks to streaming. So that was always good for me. And then when I started doing rhythm changes, my listening diet just became so geared towards that. And then when I started working for labels too, it's like I could do nothing but just listen to the albums that I work on and that I cover or consider. And like that's already too much. So it's funny how that works. And then other music that my friends put out even too that I don't cover, that still shows up for me big time as well. And so I still want to cover all that. So it's like, yeah, even though I use streaming pretty heavily in addition to having my own digital music collection, I am super oriented towards pulling and searching for music. I almost never go to algorithmic recommendations when it comes to music. I don't get there because there's already a lot that I'm pulling that I know about that I want to go and grab. And so streaming has been really convenient for me to do that. Like it's perfect for that, even though like the economics of streaming are facilitating all of this algorithmic stuff. It's like at the base level, it's like if you just want to go grab stuff off the infinite shelf, like it's awesome for that. So I've always been really grateful for that because that's a match for like what I'm looking for as a listener and a participant. Like I hear about all these albums and I want to go and pull that album. And sometimes it gets sent to me for free. Sometimes I want to buy it either digitally or physically to support my friends. But then I can just also just pull it from the big shelf of streaming. So, I mean, I've had such a positive experience with it. And I haven't felt my brain get busted by it in some of these ways. But certainly, because I'm in the arena, I see it as an issue. So it's like an issue that I witness out in the world, but I feel really lucky. I honestly don't feel like it has affected me so much. I feel like I have an antibody to it or something, you know.
Yeah, yeah. I think you hit on it, and that the push and pull distinction is like something that's already kind of been categorized by like music critics and culture critics who write about this stuff. That we went from a pull content ecosystem on the internet broadly, right? Pre the platform internet and pre social media kind of dominating what you see and consume. You had to know what you were looking for, right? You had to like go onto the iTunes store or ask a friend and then go seek it out. And everything kind of shifted to a push model where platforms realize there's like real profit incentives if they can dictate what you see, what you find, what you're checking out, especially as it pertains to maximizing your time on their platform. And so like hearing you talk about that, I mean, it makes perfect sense that you don't experience any of the ill effects because you don't have time to get pushed to. You get to, you find stuff and pull, and you have all sorts of external ways, which is kind of one of, just to skip ahead a long way, that's one of his conclusions. It's a little bit about like finding ways to switch back to that pull method. At least that's how I understand one of his conclusions.
I will say that I certainly experience it when it comes to just watching YouTube. Like I have been dragged into all kinds of different, content and ideological and video essay or whatever rabbit holes. I'm very familiar with that in terms of being pushed to me. It's just because of my weird junction that I find myself in music, like that experience doesn't come to me musically. But yeah, I feel it. That's the example of where I feel it.
With YouTube, do you think you feel that effect of I call this is maybe like way too pretentious. I call it algorithmic anhedonia, where it's like you are looking at a feed of content being recommended to you and feeling kind of nothing about it one way or the other. Like it's so perfect fit and milk toast, or at least just like it's just more of what you've always checked out. Do you have that with YouTube, or is it still, are you getting sucked in because it's a good experience?
Well, certainly both. Okay. Yeah, I compare it to, because, I just have my vanilla podcast app, and the
Sure.
podcasts that I am following, and that's not the same because then each one of them is like an album that you're pulling off, and said it's just being delivered to you because of like the nature of podcasts, right? But when I am on YouTube, the YouTube algorithm knows that I'm looking for similar things like that, and it has so many more of them to suggest me to. So yeah, sometimes it feels like an ocean of content, and like you don't want to watch anything, but like you just scroll through it all. But also sometimes it works and it's effective, and I go and I check out all these other related things. So I just, that's the main platform I notice it on, because like I've never used TikTok actually really, and I'm not like a big short form video consumer at all, so I also that doesn't hit me so much there. But like in terms of just straight up YouTube videos, like longer form, that's where I feel it.
I would agree on the YouTube front. The one that I talk to the most, I don't really have this because I don't use the platform that much, but I hear people talk about that on Netflix. It kind of almost became like a meme or a joke to like spend as much time looking for what to watch next as the thing you're trying to watch, right? Like sitting down for dinner and spending an hour choosing what to watch. And that's that same effect, I think. And that's like, to me, what I felt when I was opening the Spotify app, and this feeling Brandon describes in his first video, and what prompted the change for him.
Yeah, and then of course when he does get on the drive and like he figures out a way to listen to his music or something, he is happy that like he's just got a couple things that he's pulling. And then in week 2 he has like a music gig, almost like a wedding gig that you or I or our friends would be familiar with doing. And he asks like his bandmates for music recommendations. And it's funny, they kind of give coworker music recommendations, like they say, if you're familiar with that. It's like Billie Eilish, I think, is the first artist that gets recommended, but then they say like classic rock albums too, so gets into that. But like he solicits the recommendations for them because he doesn't have that fire hose flowing anymore, so he actually needs something to fill his iPod with. So yeah, he really turns back the clock immediately when he arrives at that gig in week 2.
Yeah, that was another part of it that like And without getting all the way into like how after watching that video and even before that, how some changes I made, and I have a much healthier music listening habit now, that like those personalized recommendations, not from an algorithm, but from your friends who know you and know what you like, I find that's been like really effective. And when someone tells me what they like or what they listen to or makes a recommendation to me, I now make a real point to like write that down, add the album to whatever, really make a point of checking that out, because I think that contributes to the anhedonia feeling where you have these songs in this kind of, millions and millions of songs in a pool, none of which really mean anything to you or aren't connected to anything beyond like, do I like this? And taste and liking is such an abstract thing, and if you have nothing to connect it to, no friend who told you about it, no experience you shared with someone, it can be really hard to latch onto. And even some beautiful music you might like, it's too, how do we call, David Turner called it like slippery or too smooth or something, right? Where it's like it kind of just slips through your fingers, and you can't quite grasp it or can't quite connect with it.
Yeah, and that comes through more in week 3 when he is in the car with another group of people. Can't remember if it's the same band or another gig or something, but they're listening to music that he has bought and put on his iPod. And he mentions that because he went out and bought the music, he felt more of a attachment or investment to it, and it facilitated him just chatting with his friends in the car about it. And it actually meant something, as opposed to if you're streaming from a playlist, you probably won't even know what it is. And so there isn't anything to talk about, but also there's just like every incentive in the world to just keep it in the background and not talk about it. But because he had a different experience, bringing it up there in terms of it being a purchased thing on his iPod, it facilitated a conversation about it and having more fun with it than it otherwise would have in the current day and age.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, maybe another, I guess you could think of it as like an anchoring thing, right? Like, do you have a reason that you're listening to what you're listening to or watching what you're watching, right? And like, it's interesting to hear or to think about your experience where you have a reason. You're connected to either this artist who's sending you something to review or to think about, or it's for work and this person, or it's a friend of yours and it's a direct connection, right? Like how you get that, all sorts of ways, and don't feel that effect of feeling disconnected from just this like fire hose of kind of whatever.
Yeah, like I'll throw another one into the pot. Like the bass player John Patitucci is like a legendary jazz bass player. I heard him in a very memorable concert it was actually before you moved to Vancouver, but I heard the Wayne Shorter Quartet at the time kind of headline the Jazz Fest. That's like the first kind of Vancouver Jazz Fest headliner show that I remember, with Danilo Perez on piano, John Patitucci on bass, Brian Blade on drums, Wayne Shorter.
Yeah.
And John Patitucci put out a new album like last month, and so like I follow, even though I don't know him, I've never worked with him. It's like I've got these like legends of the music that I keep up with, and like when I hear about them putting out a new record, then I'll go pull that too. So yeah, there's the ones and then of course you can still just be a fan of that artist.
Yeah.
But even that is kind of like an old school method when the rest, so much of it is algorithmically served up to you new and untethered to what you had seen or experienced when you were a kid or younger, etc. Right? It doesn't know that stuff. So yeah.
Well, and even if you think about, there's like gradients to that, right? So like seeing a band live, it's like a huge anchoring experience, I would say. Like I definitely have had the experience of like listening to a record, maybe not even quite hitting with me, or it doesn't stick for whatever, but I go to see the live performance of it, and all of a sudden it clicks for me. I can like, the experience is sticky. I want to be listening to that record a whole bunch. It's connected to like a experience I had with my friends. But even so, that's like maybe the strongest example, maybe next to like your friend making a record or something and you're connected to them personally. But also like what's what's also stronger than just an algorithm feeding you something is like, clicking around on your laptop on a Wednesday night and finding a music blog that's writing about a band, and you reading the article and checking it out and saying like, I want to listen to this song. And that becomes like something you did. You put in, it feels silly to call it work, but it's effort. And it's a connection you have. And like, you got to make a taste decision about that, way more than, again, something just like appearing in the up next. I should also clarify, like when we're talking about, I was saying use like fire hose and like a sea of whatever. We're not talking about the quality of the music. I think like
correct. Yeah.
Spotify is full of amazing music. I mean, in the Brandon series, he talks a little bit about the incentive problem, which we'll maybe talk about in a minute, but there isn't, it's amazing music, but when it's not connected to anything, that's where the experience becomes somewhat degraded over time. Again, I've been served stuff by an algorithm that's like blown my mind, and I'm listened to for months on end afterwards. But at scale and over time, I feel like that's where those ill effects happen, at least on my listening habits.
Yeah. Another thing I would introduce is that like you can engineer this kind of meeting like post hoc, even if you get something recommended to you based on what ends up happening. I have a super significant recent example for me where right around this time last year, I was watching A Tiny Desk because the artist played a tune that I was learning for a gig
Cool.
that I thought was going to get played by the person I was playing the gig with. And I got recommended another Tiny Desk that I had never watched before, and it was the artist Sam Amadon playing with Bill Frisell and Shazada Smiley.
Nice.
And so the next day, when I went over to my friend's place to play that tune from the other Tiny Desk, I was like, hey, you should watch this one instead because I really dug this. And like now this is like one of both my friends and mine's like favorite artists currently. And like I bought his album on LP. I brought it to your place and we spun it the other day. But that, it happened to first arrive to me algorithmically, even though a lot of our friends already knew that artist, and like it could have happened to me some other way, but I don't have to shortchange it just because it came to me through a recommendation or something. I ended up like, because I dug it so much, I like put it into play in real life kind of right away. And I have been. So you can still like get that out of it. It doesn't have to, you don't have to ignore everything that gets served up to you. If something gets served up to you and you really like it, like just take the step and like bring it back into the real world.
Yeah. So I keep sidetracking us. We're talking about, on purpose sidetracking us. We're talking about episode 3. The fourth one, what happens there?
Well, hey, in episode 3, Jason Kobler from 404 Media is the guest, and he's somebody who's known to you for sure. I mean, I've checked out 404 a little bit, but I understand you're a fan. So what did you get out of his appearance there?
I think it's Jason's work and like 404 Media kind of represent, when we think about what I was just saying, how we've had now like a decade plus of platform economy, streaming services, social media sites, algorithmic feeds everywhere. 404 Media is one of like the positive examples of like what could be next, where like, no one's making tons of money. Jason used to work for Vice. He was, I think, editor-in-chief of Motherboard, which is their tech section. And they started 404 Media after Motherboard, I think, was just like fully closed down, or maybe exists, but much smaller. And it's a newsletter. They're doing really interesting journalism. It's, from what I know, like fairly self-funded. And, there's like a newsletter subscription model doing really interesting work. And so I was very happy that like in Brandon's discovery, going from like, hey, maybe platforms aren't great for my consumption habits musically, he made it all the way to talking to Jason, who thinks critically about, what does that mean in terms of like what AI is going to do for our like generative AI. I mean, because there's also machine learning, which is maybe closer to how Spotify recommends music, but generative AI, how that's going to affect Google search, how that's going to affect the web, how that's going to affect how anyone finds anything anymore. Um, it felt very full circle. It felt like that, Brandon had kind of reached the full scope of his idea in a cool way.
Yeah, and I will add that he also interviews an artist named Revel Day in week 2, and all 3 of those interviews are what I referenced earlier, where it's like he has the full length episodes. He just cut pieces of them into the
Yeah.
series, and I haven't watched the full length episodes, so I will at some point do that, and I'll see what else they talked about. But yeah, he cut them in an interesting way to like open it up as opposed to it just being his view. So that was a cool aspect to the series.
Yeah. Yeah. It was very good choices. I mean, like the Kyle Chayka stuff, I'm a huge fan of, and I would love to do a whole episode about Filter World, Kyle Chayka's book, but
We shall.
I'm sure we will. Yeah, but I really liked the Kobler stuff, and I really like Brandon's like conclusions. I will say so to as he's going through this iPod thing and he's expanding what he means or what he's going to do, he stops using social media. He deletes the camera app off his phone. He dumbifies his phone, meaning like he takes kind of the apps off and he puts on like a little, just one screen launcher on an iPhone, which you can do. He takes it to some extremes. He starts writing his video scripts on a typewriter,
On paper, notes, and to-do lists. Yeah.
and handwritten notes and stuff as well. And he takes it to some extremes where obviously that's for the video. It seems like a sincere effort. I think some of that stuff he doesn't keep, but it's a very interesting exploration of that. He kind of he extends the idea. He's like, well, if it's Spotify, then maybe it's also Instagram, and maybe it's also, all these apps on my phone that are distracting me, and maybe what I gain from this break of just like using an iPod, I can extend to other areas of my life.
It's funny how like TikTok is barely mentioned in the series. Like he is not TikTok pilled coming in. He's fine. He's marked safe from TikTok. Like he doesn't quit it or anything. It barely shows up.
That's very funny. I imagine, just given his age and our age, like I just missed me. I think
Same.
I was at an age where when it started, I think I can opt out of this one.
And I didn't jump on it as a thing to do to promote your work as an artist or anything like that. I just did not. Yeah.
No, I think by the time it started, like the jig was up already. I mean, in that, like, it's not. I think many artists already knew it wasn't like a reliable way to get found. It was, again, the slot machine thing, but it's not. By the time TikTok started, I think it was anyone our age who'd been looking at how Instagram was going or Facebook earlier was understanding like that's not really a path to a career.
Yeah. I'll shout out somebody really quick who's local and is a kindred spirit. Is maybe somebody who I would love if she listened at some point. Angela Van Natter. I don't know if you know her. She had a podcast at some point too, and I think she's done work as a creative or a marketer, different things like that. But she has an account called YVR Concerts. The main following of it is on TikTok, as I understand, as opposed to Rhythm Changes, which is all Instagram and no TikTok. But she does TikToks and videos where she rounds up local releases. This is in the indie genres and things like that. And she's been doing this for years too. And it's a cool project that uses it well, or, the fact that it launched on TikTok first is probably to its credit. And like she just partnered on like co-presenting an edition of the Root Dwellers concert series. So she's doing cool stuff with it.
Cool. Yeah. Lots out there. Yeah, it was funny to see that, like, as far as short form video, that was like not in his, not a problem for him.
Nope.
Not something to replace either.
Yeah, we're getting basically to where he starts to put it all together, and where he really customizes his iPod. He adds more memory, makes it look cool. He's typing on a typewriter. He says his brain feels calmer. So, and he talks like very kind of almost like to a Pollyanna level of like life is just better now, which is a bit much, but I mean, yeah, he, like you said, he took it further, and he added in other experiments to this through the month thing of the original iPod idea. He layered onto it for sure.
Yeah. I kind of liked his conclusions. He dialed back some of the sillier, he stopped using the typewriter. I think at the very end he says like, here's actually where I ended up. Right, he like leaves some things off of his phone. He brings some things back that were just like impractical. Digital note taking is kind of just like a net good if you're a knowledge worker, right? You kind of need that, and
Yeah.
so handwriting exclusively or typewriting is not super practical. But I think he does settle on. I think he continues using his iPod mostly, and buying music, which is very an interesting conclusion to come to.
Yeah, and he talks about friction. I can't remember where along the line, but that, and lots of people talk about that, like, oh, the friction is removed by streaming, and that's part of the reason why it
Mm.
appeals so much. But one of the other random notes that I took along the way was like when he cuts in like a little screen video of him clicking the buy button on like Brian Eno's music for airports and then goes off to the airport. Like it's
Yeah.
not actually that high friction, is it? It's just like a slightly different way of doing it. So all the friction talk is maybe that's not really the issue. Yeah, it's like even less friction, but like digital music buying is certainly not very frictionful. Physical depends on the format. Yeah, of course it can be, but he kind of like he talks about the friction aspect of it as well, and it shows up in different amounts depending on what he's doing.
Yeah, I wonder if one's like uh, tolerance or idea of friction, because actually that's the top note that in my little notepad here is I just have like friction underlined because it
But
is
it's a
something.
paper notepad, isn't it?
It's on paper. It is something I thought about uh, in the aftermath of that in my own thing. There is something about the seamlessness of an algorithmic recommendation versus the friction of, again, like spending the time to like close your continuous feed of like Instagram reels or whatever you're doing and like read a music blog, like read 4 to 1,200 words about something that you don't know about and
If you
think
don't know
about it.
about a music blog, I'll tell you one right now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Read rhythm changes. Um, Check that out. But even that, I think the friction thing maybe ties also more into the guest on his first episode, Kyle Chayka, who wrote about Filter World, which again we'll talk about another time. But one of the theses of Filter World is that when everything's frictionless, you don't have to make any decisions about what you're doing next. In fact, Spotify like does this on purpose. They call it like lean back listening. It's kind of Spotify's whole intent is don't want you they don't want to risk you going like, actually maybe I don't want to listen to music, right? That's like they want to avoid that scenario at all costs. So everything they're serving to you should be a play button of something that you'll find pleasing.
Yes, because they, like Netflix, all they care about financially is increasing the number of total minutes. They don't
Yeah,
care what you listen to. Yeah.
totally. So I think when I was writing about this the first time, I kind of wrote down that like Spotify would rather serve you like musical pablum for eternity rather than have like something that might be really good that might risk you like pausing and thinking about it for a second or like going for a walk and like sitting with how that made you feel, right? I was thinking about the album. I think about this every time Spotify Wrapped comes around, where I look at my Wrapped and nowhere on that list is the music that like made me feel the most that year.
Yeah.
It is the music that I can listen to the most, which sometimes makes you feel the most. I mean, occasionally, and people who are really into dance music and pop music that benefits from being repeated a lot, that they might feel that way. They might look at their Wrapped and go like, this is really indicative of my favorite stuff. For me, it's not, because, I thought of the Pharoah Sanders and Floating Points record, Promises, from, I guess, 2023 or 2022 now.
Uh-huh.
And that was, I think, my favorite album that came out that year. It's beautiful, it's transcendent, and I only had to listen to it once. It's very, it's kind of slow, and you have to sit with it, and it's a bit repetitive. There's a theme that repeats throughout the whole record. And I finished it, and I was in awe, basically. I was like, that was beautiful, that was amazing. Wouldn't necessarily benefit from a repeat listen. I mean, I do come back to it every once in a while, but it certainly won't rank among the top like 30 albums as far as like how much I listen to them. And there's no way for Spotify to quantify that. And in fact, they probably didn't like that after I listened to that. I just sat for a while and was like, wow, when I think about how that made me feel, or I'm going to like write down something about that, or God forbid, go make music myself. Maybe that inspired me. But instead, Spotify would rather I just was like listening to chill lo-fi beats to sit with, and hours on end.
Yeah, there's total indifference from their side to the off-platform impact, which is probably why it feels like cold to so many artists and why they end up framing it like that. You mentioned earlier something about an incentive problem.
Yeah.
Was that something we already talked about, or did we not hit that yet? What's that?
I think that is basically this, where Spotify's incentive is to keep you on platform, right? And
yeah,
as the user, you think it's one of these things where it's like, it's a bit obscure to the user. You think Spotify would like to show you the best music or the music that you'll like the most, but it's not that. It's the music that you will keep playing the most. And some people might say that, well, that's the same thing. I'll just keep playing the music that I like the most. But of course, like with the Pharoah Sanders album, that's not the case, right? And so there's a bit of like sleight of hand where Spotify is saying like, this is the best music for you. And it's easy to buy that because sure, you probably like most of what it recommends you. It's very good at knowing what you'll be okay with. It's not great at choosing stuff that'll really blow your mind.
Yeah. So what do you want to tell, if we look over the whole series and wrap this discussion, what do you want to tell somebody who hasn't watched it yet, or somebody who only gets a distillation from you as opposed to going on the whole journey with us? What are you taking away from it, and what would you bring out to somebody if you got to introduce it to them?
I think the things that I took from it that I really liked were this idea of like, be aware when you're in an algorithmic feed. Just like mentally, if you're opening the Instagram app or you're opening Spotify or Apple Music, there are pages on some of those platforms like Spotify and Apple Music that are pages of your library that are not an algorithmically generated feed. And there are pages that are surfacing things algorithmically recommending, trying to make that a very smooth experience. And the simple act of like opening an app and thinking like, is this an algorithmic feed or am I going to pull something? Just be aware of it, because algorithmic feeds are fine at times. But if you're always swimming in that water, you're going to, I think, start to notice it's a less good experience for you.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to go a little bit more provocative even and say that going against this tide is cool. It's even in some sense countercultural. I think it's kind of obvious actually that it's countercultural.
Yeah.
But I don't think it has to be only for the young. I think there's an interesting countercultural aspect of it for people who are young enough that they've been submersed in this environment their whole lives. Like
Yep.
it is kind of obviously countercultural and apparent if you carry around an iPod, or if you take interest in these kind of things, or if like you use a flip phone or something. It's kind of maxed cool for people under a certain age. But I don't think it's only has to be for the young. I think if that appeals to you and you want to do that as a countercultural move, you can do it at any age and from any station to some extent.
Yeah.
And it's not that you have to go rush out and buy an iPod and crack it open and add more memory and stuff like that necessarily. But I just think about not being alone with it, that's probably a theme that we'll get to again and again, is like there's an isolating nature to so much of this technology, and that's because they don't care if you go out and bring it into the world with your friends off platform. They care about maximizing the number of minutes where they've got you. And so if you want to get to that place where you're like being cool because you're stepping out of the system, all you really have to do is just, when you find things that you like, can you take them to somebody else? And like, what kind of experience do you end up having? I've had so many experiences like that I've been so fortunate to, and they still kind of happen again and again, just by being in the music game. So I'm really grateful for that. I wish that for anybody.
Yeah.
So if you think it's cool to get out of this environment and get into some more analog or even just old school digital, earlier generation digital spaces. I think it's really cool, and I think it's totally like a burgeoning counterculture, as is
Yeah,
evidenced by all the hundreds of comments on these YouTube videos that we're not reading through today, but like you can go and see how it's resonated with people.
absolutely. Well said.
Yeah. Look at that, hey? Look at that. Our first big topic that
Yeah,
we just crushed. How you feeling? That was fun.
that was really fun. That was really nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I feel like it's a good it's a good feeling to feel like it's such a rich text. Like there's so much more to say about this that like we're gonna be just fine on this podcast in general of
Yeah.
continuing the thesis. Yeah, there's some stuff where we can like yeah, more notes to talk about. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. I think that that's a good place to leave it on episode 1
Yeah.
here. We will talk about what happens next, but we're going to hit it again pretty soon. And obviously, if you're listening to us talk about this right now, we have recorded a couple more episodes, and like you had to look 1 or 2 back to find this
Yeah.
one. So, but we, just like digging the grates, narrating himself there, we don't know what this is going to turn into. So
Yep.
we'll see how that goes. I am pretty shortly here heading off to go to a real life show down at Brentwood Presbyterian Church. So I'm
Nice.
looking forward to that. But yeah, thanks for getting the ball rolling and getting us talking here. I enjoyed it. So I'm excited, man.
Awesome. Me too.